What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. Okay, so as I was going through and I was doing all the prep work for our run on Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers, one of the things that I ended up realizing is that we had not really done the Ultimate Universe side of things in a lot of ways. And the reason for that is this. The Ultimate Universe was interesting to me, but whatever it was, I just kind of went through and read like the collapse of the multiverse in Marvel Comics. I only stayed on the main Marvel Universe side. I never went to the Ultimate Universe side. But the cool thing about the Ultimate Universe is that while it did originally form in 2000, while it was Marvel's way to basically say, what if superheroes existed in the real world and what would that world look like? In truth, the death of Spider-Man Peter Parker in the Ultimate Spider-Man comics basically offered Marvel a chance to kind of rework everything. I mean, in truth, it's actually as close to a reboot as we've ever gotten from Marvel Comics. Things kind of continued on, but you could literally just read like the death of Spider-Man and the events that, tie into it and whatever you need to read in order to understand it, and then just go directly into the Ultimate Universe after that. It's really a fresh jumping off point because things happen where like Captain America in the Ultimate Universe quits because he believes that if he had trained Peter Parker, he wouldn't have died. And then we get things like this, which is the origin story of Thor. Now, in the Ultimate Universe, the origin story of Thor, it kind of exists, but it's interspersed throughout the Ultimates comics. Of course, the Ultimates being the Ultimate Universe Avengers. And so it's just kind of interspersed, throughout that line of stories. What this does is it actually consolidates it all, and it takes a lot of the continuity errors that existed with regards to Ultimate Thor's origin as it existed in the Ultimates, and it condenses it down, and it makes it easier to digest, and it makes it pretty straightforward. And so one thing we need to keep in mind is that this is not like Thor from the main Marvel Universe. He'll find his return to godhood, but even then, his adventures won't be as grandiose and as huge in spectacle as the main Marvel Universe. The thing about Ultimate Universe is that it's largely confined to Earth. And so because of this, the way that Odin's son is depicted here is actually pretty cool. Now, what we do here is we initially pick up really with the European Super Soldier program. Now remember, in the Ultimate Universe, one of the biggest differences is that Captain America Steve Rogers was not the first test subject for the Super Soldier Serum. The first successful test subject was Nick Fury. And so with Nick Fury proving to be the successful test subject, the serum was then administered to Captain America Steve Rogers. The result is that he became the same kind of Captain America that we're the most familiar with from the main Marvel Universe. And in the same origin story, playing out the same way, Dr. Abraham Erskine, the guy who had basically given Captain America the serum, had ended up dying. And so because of this, what it did is it basically led to this, quote unquote, super soldier serum race, so to speak, in the sense that you had all these major powers across the world, Russia, Germany, all of them basically making this mad dash to have their own super soldier program. But with Thor, we don't really know much about him. All we know is that he's just here one day. Now, for whatever reason, the European government had basically looked at him as the best suitable candidate for their own super soldier program. But the difference here is he's not being given a serum. He's basically being given a belt, a harness, and some means to control the weather and so on and so forth. So it's actually kind of cool the way this plays out. Now, of course, the indication here in terms of why he was such a great specimen is because he's just built really well. I mean, look at the guy. The guy's got muscles on top of muscles. It's absolutely insane. Not only that, though, the biggest issue the European government's coming across is that he's literally just scribbling all these different things that are in some ancient language that nobody really seems to be able to understand, save for a guy named Donald Blake. Now, this is kind of interesting, and it actually gets a little bit hairy when you start getting into the Donald Blake character. Originally, in Marvel Comics, back when Thor first popped up, Donald Blake and Thor were two sides of the same coin. The idea was that when Thor resided in Asgard, he was arrogant, he was full of hubris. Odin wanted to teach him a lesson in humility, and so he cast him to Earth and basically stripped his knowledge of the fact that he was Thor and placed him in the body of a guy named Donald Blake, who was basically a doctor. The idea was that treating the sick, treating the infirm, those who couldn't take care of themselves, would teach Thor humility. And when the time came where he had the option to lift his hammer, this humility would either prove itself to make him worthy, or it would not prove itself and he would just simply stay unworthy. The result was that he picked it up, realizing that he was Thor. And so what ended up happening is Marvel went forward with this kind of Superman Clark Kent alter ego situation, in the sense that when Odin's son was being a superhero, he was Thor. When he was being a regular person, he was Donald Blake. Now, because of the fact that alter egos basically began to become a thing of the past, in the sense that unless you were Spider-Man, Batman, or Superman, you really didn't have a reason for an alter ego, eventually the Donald Blake persona began to just weed out. And the result was that most every single story that we ever saw almost never featured Donald Blake. Instead, it only ever featured Thor. Now, of course, course, what this also does is this leads directly into the introduction of a character named Balder. Now, Balder is really interesting when it comes to Marvel Comics, and the reason for this is because, again, keeping things confined to Marvel as opposed to the real world Norse mythology, the death of Balder is supposed to signify the coming of Ragnarok, which is to say, the destruction of Asgard. Now, the biggest reason why this is an issue is because, as far as I am aware, Balder did not die before the events of the original Ragnarok in the main Marvel stories, which is to say, Thor Ragnarok, that actual story itself. Instead, it was actually Odin who died. He died at the hands of Surtur. The idea is that this is the reason why, if you go back and you read The Last Days of Loki and Loki, Agent of Asgard, we end up finding out that the cycle of Ragnarok can actually never be stopped, that it always goes on forever and ever and ever. Thor's tried to stop it an infinite number of times before, and he's always failed every single time. Within the Ultimate Universe, Balder, his death does signify the coming of Ragnarok. Again, very realistic, very much playing into the concept of how it's supposed to be. And so in this instance, Balder is the biological son of Odin and Frigga, whereas Thor is the biological son of Odin and Gaia. And then of course, Loki is the biological son of a frost giantess and Odin himself. So really, Balder is the only true son of Odin. But again, these characters basically make up the Warriors Three. Of course, Loki, Thor, and Balder, and that's really about it. Now, this is not significant. It's not hugely important. It's just designed to show us that these guys really hang out. These guys basically chill and have fun, and like battle is how it is. They celebrate their moments and so on and so forth. It's also the idea that Odin is having a hammer commissioned for Thor, basically this hammer that will imbue part of Odin's power. Now, the other half of this is that Odin is vastly different in the Ultimate Universe versus the main Marvel counterpart. And again, we'll talk more about that as we progress through this story. But transitioning back to 1939 with the Germans, what we end up having is basically Baron Helmut Zemo and Baron Zemo. And the idea here is that we essentially have them grabbing the Norns. Now, the Norns, depending on what line of publications we're talking about, change in different ways. In the Ultimate Universe, the Norns are a means by which people can basically access the Asgardian realms. That's really what it is. You don't need the Bifrost. You can just use the Norns and then walk into any one of these realms. In the main Marvel comics, the Norns are actually these super powerful artifacts, kind of like the Asgardian version of the Infinity Stones to a degree. They don't really let you warp reality per se, but they do give you the power of godhood. That's how it is that Thor became Rune King Thor after absorbing these Norns and then just becoming like this crazy demigod being. It's really kind of weird. You only see him for a short amount of time within the confines of that story, but here in this one, basically it's the idea that there are 24 Norn stones, 21 of which can be arranged in any particular order by threes, and then you can access the different realms based on how you restructure them. The last three will actually be a major talking point for the end of this video, but because of the fact that the Germans are basically trying to find ways to access this Asgardian weaponry, so on and so forth, for the purpose of winning World War II, what ends up happening is they actually access the realm of the Frost Giants, which is really kind of cool here, because when they do, this basically begins the process of initiating Ragnarok. What we end up doing is we actually switch over to, again, the point that was ages ago with the discussion between Odin and Thor. And this is where I said we would talk about the power of Odin within the realm of the Ultimate Universe. Because of the fact that the Ultimate Universe is designed to be more grounded, Odin, as he exists here, is not godly, which is to say he's not this near omnipotent, almost indestructible being like he is in the main Marvel Universe. Instead, he's really more of just a guy who ties Asgard to the existing plane, which is to say he is Asgard and Asgard is him. Like, Odin really goes to Thor and simply just says, if I am destroyed, Asgard will be destroyed as well. I am the life force by which Asgard floats. I am the source of its energy, and it's the source of my energy. The two go hand in hand. The other half of this is that when it comes to the hammer of Thor, it's really Odin just kind of throwing his own power into the hammer per se, and then that's how it is that he determines who can wield it and who can't. Now, this is actually a much better explanation than we got when it came to the main Marvel Universe. In the main Marvel Universe, originally, it was just Odin crafted the hammer of Thor, and like he put a spell on it, only those who were worthy could lift it. We didn't really know why it was so powerful, except for the fact that it had something to do with magic. It wasn't until the last year or so that Marvel came along and said, well, actually, inside of this hammer is this sentient storm capable of wiping out half the universe or something that crazy. So he's channeling this insane level of energy, which is why the hammer is so capable. And that's really about it. There's really no explanation there. It's just kind of how the way it works. And so again, this provides a far more tangible explanation because within the hammer is part of Odin's essence. And so you could almost imagine that the essence inside of the hammer can think for itself. And so somebody who walks up and tries to pick up the hammer, the essence of Odin says, actually, you're not worthy, so I'm not going to let you lift me. And it's a far more simple and a far easier to understand explanation in terms of how it works. Now, of course, the other half of this is in the modern day. When we deal with the Donald Blake persona, we deal with this Thor character, and the idea idea that the European government's trying to figure out what's going on. The biggest struggle that the European government has is, yes, they live in a world where there are beings who can fly around. Yes, they live in a world where there are beings who have all manner of powers and a guy who can crawl on walls. Yes, these characters are very capable, but going to the European government and saying, hey, we have this guy who can turn into like a giant mean version of himself that's gray is far easier to explain, as opposed to, we have this guy who claims that he's like the Thor from Norse mythology, and like we believe him. Like at that point, it just sounds bonkers. And I know it's kind of weird. It seems weird to say that, but again, that's the basis of the Ultimate Universe, is that it's really a measure of what you can see as opposed to what you can't see. But what we end up doing is we basically pick up with the fall of the Frost Giants. Now remember, in the Ultimate Universe, when it came to the Frost Giants being defeated, it was basically this idea that Odin procreated with a frost giantess, a female frost giant, for the purpose of seeding an heir, and then essentially saying, this heir will basically be the truce by which we function. I will take this heir as my own. He will be a continuation of your legacy should something ever happen to you, but until then, you stay away, I stay away, everybody's fine. The issue with this is that it led ultimately to this truce that nobody is really happy with, and so because of that, Loki literally goes to see his mom and says, I know you're angry, I know you hate living here, I know you don't like it here, but you are my mother, I have more loyalty to you than I do to Odin, tell me what you want and I will give it to you. And she basically says, get me the Norns. And so this directly leads into the idea that it's effectively Loki, again, continuing the cycle of Ragnarok. Now, of course, when it also comes to Asgard, at least access to Asgard, it's not done by traditional means, which is to say, there isn't really a Bifrost per se. Really, it's just like Heimdall guarding the entryway to Asgard, which is to say, anybody who's able to travel to a location, rearrange these Norns, and then in turn access Asgard, Heimdall will stop them if they're not supposed to be there. Now remember, Heimdall is one of these characters where he's one of the most powerful Asgardians. He's not the most powerful. Because of this, the evolution of his character and the strength that he's capable of has been contextual over the years. In this scenario, he's taken out by an arrow to the eye. But it actually turns out to be interesting. And the reason why is because this is not just any arrow, this is an arrow that belongs to Loki. And so what we end up finding out, or at least what's being teased to us here, is that between the time that Loki had gone to his mother and his mother said, get me the Norns, and this moment in 1939, he initiated Asgard. And the result is that he was basically banished from Asgard proper. We just don't really know why. We're not really sure how all this ended up taking place. And so what we end up doing is we basically lead to this massive assault in 1939 by Loki with the Frost Giants and this German army all on Asgard. And so again, it's basically starting this massive cycle of Ragnarok. Now, this is interesting because in both the Ultimate Universe and the main Marvel line of comics, Loki is always the guy who basically leads the charge against Asgard. He's always the guy who brings Asgard down. That's just the way it works. I did ask you guys previously how close the Marvel Comics line of stories were to like Norse mythology, and a lot of you guys said it's pretty close except for like these one or two things. So that's always kind of a cool scenario. But the idea here is that with Loki basically initiating Asgard, the first person to fall is Balder. And that's basically where all this begins to kick off. Balder's death triggered the cycle of Ragnarok. And so that's essentially how this played out. Loki went to his mom said, get me the Norns. Loki went to go steal the Norns. Balder, as the eyes of Odin, realized what Loki was doing. He went to go confront him. Loki killed him by accident. The cycle of Ragnarok starts. And so what it did is it basically led all the way up to 1939 when Ragnarok actually begins. And so because of this, it's Loki basically invading Asgard and destroying everything, literally just bringing it all down around everyone. Now, the problem with this is that with Odin realizing Loki was the one who started this, what he basically does is he grabs Loki and throws him inside of the World Tree. Now, this is important because the World Tree is basically this room with no doors. It's this eternal prison. People are not allowed to leave except under one of two circumstances. The first is that Odin retrieves them, and the second will be explained at the end of this video. So, in response, the king of the Frost Giants actually ends up killing Odin. And so, of course, with Odin being killed, we end up having the World Tree being totally obliterated. Thor does what he can to take out the rest of the Frost Giants, and then he's reborn. Now, in the main Marvel line of comics, this is the post-Ragnarok line of stories to a degree, which is to say, the movie as it exists in the Marvel Cinematic Universe is coming out in November. It'll actually be a combination of Planet Hulk and Thor Ragnarok. But in the main Marvel line of stories, there was Thor Ragnarok, which basically led to the destruction of Asgard. Everybody basically died. All the Asgardians were gone. And then Odin's son son was reborn on Earth and then began the process of traveling around and finding all the Asgardians, restoring Asgard back in Broxton, Oklahoma, and then just kind of going forward from there. This follows a very similar path. The difference here is that on the surface, he's basically not running around and waking up Asgardians. Instead, it's actually Baldur who comes to him, in the sense that Odin ensured that when he died, both Baldur and Thor would be reborn. The difference here is that they are reborn as humans. They are not reborn as gods. And so right now, if somebody were to walk up to Thor in this room where him and Baldur are talking and they shoot him with a gun, he'd be dead. That'd be it. But because of the fact that the two of them are greeting each other again for the first time, because Baldur basically says, I have been reborn in human form and I've been operating under the name of Donald Blake and I've been looking for you, is basically a reversal of the main Marvel universe. Instead of Thor tracking down all the Asgardians, Baldur has been tracking down Thor. This is really just Baldur saying the time will come when Odin will return, and the time will come when Asgard will be restored back to the way it was before. Thus is the cycle of Ragnarok. And so the result is that because these guys, as part of the European government, just need a super soldier of their own to really verify the billions of dollars that they spent, what they end up doing is they give Odin's son this giant harness that gives him super strength, a limited amount of invulnerability. They also give him a hammer that allows him to channel storms and so on and so forth. And then he basically goes forward as Thor and ends up joining the Ultimates. And so again, this is basically his origin story. It's where he comes from. It's how all this basically came into play, and is why his hammer looks so cool. But with the tail end of this, we end up catching up on those last 3 Norn stones. And what we find out is that while the other 21 stones can be reshuffled and reworked for the purpose of accessing the different realms of Asgard, the last 3 Norn stones, no matter what way you arrange them, will basically be able to access the room without doors, which is to say the place where Loki is imprisoned. And so what this does is, by virtue of Helmut Zemo grabbing the last 3 Norn stones and then traveling to this landscape more or less and activating the stones, what it does is it allows Loki to leave the room with no doors. It frees him from his imprisonment, allowing him to go forward as basically this guy who's just going to do bad things and whatever it is that Loki does. And so because of this, again, it's a pretty cool origin. It's a pretty cool little thing when it comes to his character. But again, this is basically a fresh jumping off point, because at this moment, you start jumping into Jonathan Hickman's Ultimates, which is actually a pretty amazing story. And of course, Ultimates and all those stories lead directly into the collapse of the multiverse, Secret Wars, all those things, Ultimatum, I think it is, where Galactus gets thrown into the Ultimate Universe after Age of Ultron, and then him and his Ultimate Universe version merge. Dude, it's crazy. Like, he just becomes this crazy version of Galactus. Anyway, guys, if you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace.